With that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We have Ian McDonald, is a HITRUST assessor team lead at Enterprise Health, and Liz Golden is our HITRUST program manager at Enterprise Health. They are HITRUST rock stars and can answer any question you have. And then we also have Dennis Gallagher, Senior VP of Sales at Enterprise Health, who will be acting as our moderator and adding his wonderful spin on everything. So with that, Dennis, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure do. Can you hear me okay? Make sure my microphone's on.
I can, yep.
Good. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Siobhan mentioned my name is Dennis Gallagher. I'm a sales executive. I've got about 25 years in healthcare IT, worn various hats over the years, and very happy the last 4 years I've been working with Enterprise Health, an organization that is has a very robust security practice and a high trust practice. We also have a digital front door, a patient engagement solution as well, which we're not here to talk about today, but that does round out our portfolio. So with regards to HITRUST, we've been doing this for over 10 years. We were one of the first assessors in HITRUST, and I think 2011, we became an external assessor. So we bring to the table years and years of experience and literally have assessed and work with hundreds of customers over the years. So we have a lot of experience. We know where the trap doors are. And one of the things we wanted to do here today is to sort of share that institutional knowledge that we have with both Liz and Ian, who will take over the subject matter expertise portion of it, but wanted to just sort of prep anybody who's considering HITRUST and those that have already been down it, so you can get them some information that might be useful with that. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to both Ian and Liz to discuss some of the challenges to certification, and we'll take it from there.
All right, thank you so much, Dennis. This is Ian McDonald talking. So the first time, considering we have some newbies here, first time you touch an assessment is the scoping process. Traditionally at Enterprise, the CSMs conduct this. The assessors don't really do much for the scoping because the CSMs have the subject matter expertise. But this is certainly a challenge for a lot of new clients. And in many ways, the scoping process is the most critical because it's the first time you're touching the assessment, you're defining what the assessment needs to encompass. And that's based on what's critical to your business. And scoping can be confusing. We often see this. It's why we make it a collaborative process between us and our customers. And it needs to be because nobody understands your own needs, practices, and environment better than you do yourself. We bring the HITRUST methodology to the table and apply that to help you tailor your scope as best as possible. But at the end of the day, it's entirely the customer's decision what the scope should be. And it's typically it can be weeks, the scoping process, and it can be tailored, but we do try to define it early on, as early as possible, because it does, as stated, define exactly how much work is involved, what requirements are generated, and how we approach the assessment from the start.
Yeah, and Dave, may I add just a couple points to that, because working with so many customers over the years, is we prefer to do an assessor-assisted scoping. There's nothing to prevent you, for those that have already done it, you're already under sale, but those that may be considering HITRUST, you can go out there and get the My CSF portal and just go out and scope yourself. And we do have customers that come to us that have done that previously. We highly recommend against that. Scoping is probably the most important of the 4 phases of a HITRUST journey. And our reason we like to do it is that typically organizations that are left to their own devices and do their own scope will almost always overscope themselves, giving themselves more requirements and controls. That's a term that's synonymous. You'll hear assessors use both with that. And our approach on an initial validated assessment, which is an R2, and I'm going to be giving more information on the 2 different types of assessments after a few more slides, but is to cut that, be as accurate as possible, but cut that slice of pie as narrow as possible. Our goal is to get you over the finish line, into the end zone, if you will, to get certified. And again, so that's why it's so important that scoping is done very deliberately and accurately. Otherwise, you'll end up just giving yourselves way more work than's needed in order to get certified. Thank you. That's the point.
Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate that. So yeah, why certify as well? Key points, and we see this, clients have different motivations, of course, for why they pursue HITRUST certifications, but it is at its core the CSF, that is a cybersecurity framework, and a comprehensive one at that. So attaining HITRUST certification is a business differentiator in most industries, and anyone completing a HITRUST certification can provide an attractive level of assurance regarding their organization's cybersecurity posture in general, because it is very comprehensive. It is a big commitment to attain this certification. So as such, it speaks to a level of commitment to your organization's own data and cybersecurity. So a great business differentiator. It can also be requirements. We see this often as well, that major payers or big business partners for the client have required HITRUST certification within a period of time. And that's becoming more common too, that certain instances and organizations are compelled to get HITRUST certification. It doesn't really matter. Regardless, it is a thorough process and certainly a big business differentiator for your business. So, and it's why HITRUST as well has become an industry standard. System organization, this is something to keep in mind when regards to scope as well, and what a HITRUST certification actually is, because HITRUST doesn't certify systems per se, and it doesn't certify technologies, not people, and not the organization itself really. What it's certifying is this specific iteration of systems, i.e. your implemented systems in your organizational context. So, and that's what the scope is. It's defining this specific implementation. So certifying Azure for one organization will have to be re-certified in another because of the different context and the different environment and moving parts. So it certifies implemented systems at its core. And as Dennis mentioned, the scope, we typically see over-scoping. Clients are very eager to include as much as possible in their scope. However, it is about defining business needs and right sizing, because increasing the scope will drastically increase the work involved in the assessment, perhaps more than is needed. HITRUST requirements can range from, we see anything from 200 to 500 or 600 requirements in an assessment or controls. And the pool so far is about 2,100 requirements, and checking off haphazardly on various factors can increase the span and workload intensely. So these check boxes have some serious implications, which is why the scoping process is important. Another issue we see, or challenge rather, we see during the assessments typically pertains to process. We usually work with the 3 primary maturity levels in an assessment, which is policy, process, and implemented for each control. Implemented weighs the most. However, process and policy do have an impact on the total score, a pretty significant impact, 35% out of the 75 points. So process, being 20% of that, is important, and we see clients often focusing a bit on implemented and not very well documented processes, and the documentation definitely needs to be in order. So we focus on this early in the assessments as well. So either undocumented or ad hoc processes are typical that we see, which we can at most score 25 per HITRUST methodology. And they often are outdated or don't represent what actually happens. So when engaging in a HITRUST certification or assessment process, be prepared to do some serious rehauls for policies and processes, especially if you haven't touched them in a long time or haven't really done any thorough work on them, because they are pretty thoroughly examined and they do have a big impact on the assessment's result as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Over to you, Liz.
Yeah, so to go off of what Ian's saying, the next challenge that we often see is that organizations have trouble staying focused on the assessment. And that means keeping their timeline, making sure that they're hitting those goals in order to reach their certification, or their submission timeline. So most customers that we see for initial assessments, it takes about 12 to 18 months. That's not to say that you can't go through that process more quickly, but in order to get through it in less time, it does take significant dedication in terms of resources, how many people you have working on those projects, time, whether or not those individuals are dedicated to the HITRUST effort or if they're doing it on top of their full-time position, and quality can often suffer if those first 2, time and resources aren't met. Commitment from leadership, I mean, this kind of relates back to staying focused. I'm going to kind of combine it all together, but the commitment from leadership is important too, because HITRUST doesn't just sit in compliance or in IT. It reaches into other parts of the organization. So unless you have leadership, enforcing this across the entire organization, it's very difficult to get through a certification effort. It's also, it's not just a one and done. You do your initial certification and then you move on. It's year over year over year. You have HITRUST work. It could be every year if you're working with an I1, and Dennis will get into the differentiators later with an I1 and R2. But in an I1, it could be every year you're doing a full assessment. With an R2, it's every 2 years that you're doing an entirely new assessment. So it is important to make sure that that buy-in is there so you have the time for it.
Thank you, Liz. I'll just add, I think what's so important before we jump to this next slide is there's one point or facet of a successful HITRUST project that I try to impart when I speak to prospects who reach out, again, because they got to get certain, usually somebody, an organization that has to get certified because they have a customer that's demanding it. But regardless of your reason for getting certified, you have to keep a very, you have to keep cadence. You have to keep a very consistent cadence of the project. So it's something to think about that has to keep moving. And what Liz has mentioned, some of the work that you need to do, you'll be assigned various domains to audit yourself, to grade yourself, that get sent over to our assessors, and they need to be delivered in a certain amount of time, or not a certain amount of time, but there's dates that'll be set. And it's very important that that work is done to keep the project moving. And that seems to be one of the areas, and I'm just sharing again, one of the trap doors we run into, or organizations get tripped up with that, maybe underestimating the level of effort to get HITRUST certified. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but it is a big lift to get certified with that. But every organization that is getting certified, they all have a day job too, right? They have a production system they got to keep running. They have tickets they're taking care of, et cetera. So think about, as you're moving forward and considering HITRUST, the additional effort and time it's going to take for your organization to succeed. And then keep in mind, cadence is absolutely essential to a successful project.
Very good point. Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, and a few of the keys to success that we see or have experienced have a very positive impact on how the assessment is conducted, and the results that we see are employees that are clients that come prepared by having trained their employees beforehand in the framework, either through, you can engage an external assessor and ask for resources on this front as well, but having familiarity with the CSF before coming in is a great benefit, because it allows you to start earlier, actually engaging controls and providing evidence, and you're kind of more in tune with the assessor, can speak in the same, stay on the same page when it comes to how each control should be addressed. And we don't expect anyone to come in as experts, not at all. It certainly is a comprehensive framework, and understanding all the nuances is not expected, but having some exposure and familiarity for the appropriate employees who will be engaging with this and will be the people of contact for the assessor team and the CSMs, a huge benefit. And it's as Liz mentioned, it's important to keep in mind as well that the CSF touches all aspects of an organization. It is not just cybersecurity. Cybersecurity in general touches all aspects of an organization, which is why the CSF does as well. To use some sort of, there are 19 domains as stated, and to use that as an example, we have the information security program, but also data privacy, mobile security, and physical security. We conduct physical walkthroughs of the facility. And also on each of these levels and domains, we need appropriate management approval for things. We need to see that sanctioned processes that are at the bottom of all of these implemented systems. So it is not solely an IT security effort. Management is included, HR is often included. So it touches basically every aspect of the organization. And people who are engaged, and we see this too, and especially with initials, they need to understand their roles often. The organization should take a deliberate approach to how they assign various tasks to each of the people involved in a HITRUST assessment. This is especially important for big organizations where there are multiple departments and evidence needs to come through many tiers and layers of internal corporate bureaucracy and department sort of policies. Putting one person on the entire assessment, that might work for small organizations. For bigger ones, you need more people, more departments engaged. There needs to be sort of a deliberate and conscious approach to how you're assigning work. That would be a major tip, at least from what we've seen from successful assessment. And
I'm sorry. Please
sorry, did you have something to add, Dennis?
No, please continue.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right, so educating leadership about the impending changes, and not just leadership. What we typically see as well is, the IT infrastructure and the security systems and mechanisms that are employed and the whole design of the infrastructure, that is often someone's baby. We see this very often that there might be some resistance to making changes, disagreements with scores, which is natural because a lot of work is at the bottom of these infrastructures. So be prepared to having to implement some changes, make some remediation efforts that might be uncomfortable or might be require some work, both for leadership and for typically IT heads and even the IT team as well, security team, CISO, et cetera. There are impending changes, especially for an initial, where you might have to, I'm not going to say necessarily acquire new systems. That isn't typically what we recommend, but making changes to how things are done in terms of processes, policies. There might be some comprehensive changes depending on what is found. So definitely prepare leadership to be able to provide those resources that are necessary to do that. Very important to be honest with oneself. We see this typically also with those who are very invested in the infrastructure they've built, which makes sense, of course. But they're very likely it's not going to be a perfect score. I think for as long as I've been here, Liz, you'll probably attest to this as well. I have never seen a client initial succeed on the first path. And when I say succeed, I mean attain a passing score on all domains first pass. So definitely be prepared to have to make some changes and be honest with oneself on that front. And then setting realistic and attainable timelines. That's a very big one. Clients often come in with very high expectations, and that's fine. But the assessor will of course do their best. We do our best to satisfy these timelines and to provide this service as efficiently and as quickly as possible. But there are overhauls that need to be done, and coming in and wanting a certification within 3 months, it's just not possible, both in terms of the work effort that's required, the changes that need to be made. So cooperate with your assessor and set these realistic and attainable timelines so that we don't implode in on ourselves while we're working, because it will require both commitment and time. So
just to jump in slightly, and I'm backtracking a little, but you mentioned we don't often see customers passing their domains on the first pass. Just to make sure, what we mean by that is that we do like a gap analysis to see the current state of your program. At that point, very early in the process, we often don't see customers that pass our internal review of them, but we don't mean by the time you get to certification, you're passing, because we go through a remediation process. I just want to make sure that was clear.
Very good point.
But yeah, initial certification. Yeah, initial certification. By the time you get to submission, we actually don't. Our customers, I don't think we've seen customers that haven't passed at that point. But during the gap analysis phase, it's often that you find a ton of gaps that you then need to remediate before you can go and submit your assessment.
Very good point. Thank you for the clarification, Liz. Yes, of course, the ultimate goal of engaging us as a business partner is to get you certified, and we provide that commitment. It's just that this needs to be coupled with realistic timelines. And of course, we're not going to submit something we don't think will actually be certified. But in the beginning, as we do these initial passes and gap analysis, like Liz mentioned, there will be some red thumbs, to use the proper technical term from the CSF. So be prepared for that, of course. And engaging a partner before work starts, very important. That also feeds into building these realistic timelines and scoping and the whole sort of 9 yards there. Getting some expectations set and some exposure beforehand, very, very useful, and also sort of helps you guide where you should be working and how you should be working, because doing the sort of self-guided model, while not impossible, without defining your scope, without defining the framework and generating the assessment with the requirements, starting work beforehand can end up incurring a lot of unnecessary work or wrong work. So definitely engage a partner before work starts, so you don't start off on the wrong track. And then the last point, very important as well. HITRUST doesn't end with certification. It is a recurring process. There are recertifications and interims that need to be conducted. So it is kind of a lifelong commitment to maintaining a solid cybersecurity posture. So it is a lifestyle as opposed to a fire and forget kind of project. So understand multiple layers there. Yep.
And I'll go through this next slide relatively quickly so we can make sure we get to everything. And also because I think a lot of this we've already touched on. So the first point here is that having a dedicated HITRUST resource is a huge benefit to any organization going through the certification process. If you have someone whose full-time job, or at least a large portion of their job, is dedicated to coordinating this assessment, reaching out to different arms of the organization and making sure you have the correct materials that you need, you understand the processes, that streamlines the assessment tremendously. If you can't dedicate a HITRUST resource, it is just a matter of making sure that the resources you have time set aside to do the HITRUST assessment. Whether that's a certain amount of hours per week or maybe per month, having those metrics to work with is huge for the success of the assessment. And like Ian mentioned, I mean, this is a big part of the idea of sticking to the timelines that you set for yourself. If you don't have a dedicated resource and you can't set aside those hours, then you have to make sure that the timelines are realistic as well. So maybe that 9 to 12 months, or sorry, maybe that 12 to 18 months of, you know, our plan for initial assessment is typically 12 to 18 months. Maybe that gets pushed out, or maybe you need to hire new resources in order to hit that deadline. Similarly, dividing and conquering is a big part of the assessment because it's kind of a broken record at this point, but like we said, it reaches into all parts of the organization. So often what we find, especially with larger organizations, is that it's helpful to have owners for different parts of the HITRUST assessment itself, along with subject matter experts in, in different areas that are familiar with the assessment that can help the owners of the HITRUST assessment complete it. So one example I like to use is there's a domain dedicated to training, and a lot of the training and onboarding, and a lot of the information that you need for that, whether it be the content of the training slides or records for completed training, signed attestations, that might be something that HR is responsible for and owns. But you, as someone working in compliance, trying to complete the HITRUST assessment, you might need all that information. And so having a subject matter expert and a resource in HR that you're familiar with, that you talk to, who understands what the HITRUST assessment is, that helps a ton when it comes to validation time and you're collecting samples and trying to finish out your assessment. It also helps with accountability because you end up having assigned individuals who both the assessor will know and who internally are kind of tied to that assessment. The 3 M's down there, I think we've touched on most of this throughout the course so far, but the management oversight of the entire assessment effort is crucial to getting things done on time, and also just to making sure that you can pass. Like Ian mentioned before, if you needed to implement a new system or a new process in order to pass your certification, having that management buy-in is absolutely necessary. I believe Dennis talked about having meetings and just having time set aside on a recurring basis to ensure that the effort is continued both week over week during your certification effort for the initial certification, month over month, and then as you get certified and move into the next phases, year over year. And metrics we've gone through a couple times as well. And they relate to the other two. Just having a way to track that progress, to keep yourselves accountable, is really a key to success for the HITRUST assessment.
So the assessment type. So what's new to HITRUST is earlier this year, or late last year, around the Christmas time frame, the holidays, shortly thereafter, HITRUST released a new certification for the industry called the I1. But prior to talking about the I1, I want to talk about the ART, what they now relabeled the initial validated assessment, the ART2, which is their legacy assessment, and which is much of what we were speaking about here for the last 15 to 20 minutes. So the R2 has a scoping component, which I think we drove home the point is how important having an accurate scope is. And this is something that you can do yourself, but obviously as I mentioned, we prefer to do that with you to make sure it's accurate. And depending on and basically the idea is what HITRUST does on an R2 is depending on your exposure to risk, the more controls or requirements you'll have with that. So for example, one of the questions, and those that have been through this know this, but when you're going through the scoping exercise, they're going to know how many records you hold, right? So an organization that holds or gets 5,000 a day versus one that gets 5 million a day has much different security exposure to that. So depending on how exposed you are will determine how complicated and how many controls and requirements you'll get. With that, as Ian mentioned in his comments earlier, an average is around 300, 350 to 500. 500 it's quite a bit. You'll see that more with like payers, or if you have just a lot of records that you're managing. It's almost, in total, there's about 1,900, but I've never seen any organization have all 1,900. It also, and this is a very important point and differentiator between this and the I-1, the R2 considers your policy and it grades on it, your procedure and your implementation, with the implementation being graded the heaviest, and also measured and managed. On an initial validated assessment, we typically do not focus on or contemplate much the measured and managed. We focus on the first three: policy, procedure, and implementation. With that, those three added up are 75% of your score. A passing grade is 71. So again, our approach is on your initial validated assessment is to get you certified. And there's no asterisk with certification, whether you have CAPS, which is no corrective action plan, or regardless of where you are, there's measured and managed. Once you get a certification, you're certified. With that, it has a 2-year life cycle too. This is why they call it the R2. So you have your initial validated assessment, which we've said takes 12 to 18 months. Once that gets submitted, that's your anniversary date. It'll take the HITRUST Alliance 2 months maybe. They're a little backed up to audit our validated assessment we submitted on your behalf. Once they proclaim you certified, they backdate it to the date it was submitted. So what's important to note, because you have 1 year from the date of your submission, not the date that they certified you, but the date that you submitted the certification, which we do on your behalf, to do your interim. And with the interim, they're going to give you 19 random requirements that they're going to audit deeply, and then any caps that you have, a corrective action plan. And all of our customers at Enterprise Health always have caps, and it's not a bad thing because nobody's ever perfect with security. Security is a journey, not a destination. You never get fully secure, right? I think we would all agree with that. So in the interim year, you get those 19 random requirements assigned, and then whatever caps you have. And then on the anniversary of your initial validated assessment, that gets submitted, and then you'll move into the recertification. And basically the whole process starts all over again on the latest version of the MyCSF or the framework with that. And this just goes on back and forth between a recert and an interim ad infinitum, or until you decide to no longer be certified. It also allows you to pick various regulatory factors and there's some down there. So the NIST, you can do FedRAMP, GDPR, and I see there's 37 others. I'm certainly not going to rip them off, but there's a lot of other regulatory factors, California Civil Code, et cetera, that you can pick. It doesn't get you certified on it, but it comports your object to those particular frameworks with that. So that's the R2, the legacy way, the way they've been doing it for years. The I-1, which we just came out with, has come out to address the needs for organizations that maybe are smaller or don't need that higher level of assurance. And as such, they've made it easier to get certified. Now, it's not going to be as a rigorous process because you're not getting as many controls. And what they've done is they do a static 219 set controls, regardless of the size of your organization. And it only contemplates, and this is the big difference, implemented controls. It does not consider policy and procedure with that. And that's an important note because many organizations, when they get into doing the legacy or the R2 certification, the policy and procedure tends to be the one area where most organizations need help. Many organizations will have a policy or that they follow, such as I like to use the example of password reset, right? You probably all reset your passwords every 3 to 6 months with a strong password, et cetera. But is it written down? When was it written down? Is it complete enough? And this is the stuff that our assessors will review, and we'll go back and forth to make sure that's shored up. So most organizations really struggle and are surprised at how much they need to do with policy and procedure. And a very important note too to mention is HITRUST, even with implemented, but policy and procedure as well, it's 100% evidentiary in nature. You cannot just say, I do it. You have to produce a screen print, a Word doc, a PDF, an Excel, a video, whatever. You have got to produce evidence for every single control that you have with policy, procedure, and implement it, right? So in the I-1, you don't have to consider the policy and procedure, and it's only this 219. It also, you cannot pick any regulatory factor. So as you're considering the I-1, I think a very important question to ask is, will it meet your requirements on what you're seeking to achieve? And oftentimes those requirements may be driven by a third party and the customer or prospect that you're working with that's demanding that certification. So this is a big push right now with HITRUST, and for obvious reasons, because they had many organizations, and I think we've stressed a lot of work to get certified. And I think 66% of the folks on this call today are in the process of getting certified, and will certainly attest to the amount of effort it is to get certified. So this is sort of the answer from HITRUST to get more organizations moving forward and getting certified with it. And it's also a way for them to compete, frankly, with the SOC 2, which many organizations will have a choice to do a SOC 2 or HITRUST. It's easier to do a SOC 2 than it is to get HITRUST and an R2 with that. So that's a very important point to look at as you're considering it. Also worth mentioning, you can come out of the gate doing an I-1, which you'll do every year. There's not the interim there with that. Just you do it 1 year, then you do it again, and it just keeps going. But you can graduate, if you will, if need be, business need or desire, to the R2 further down. So you do the I-1 this year and then move into the R2 if your business needs mandate that you do that. Okay.
Real quickly there, Dennis. The
Yeah,
passing score for any given domain in an R2 is 62. Just so we have the right numbers out there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I may have meant it. So a 71 is a passing without a cap. If you get a 62 and a 70, sorry, I should have, thank you, Ian, I should have clarified that. Between a 62 and a 70, you'll get a cap, right? It means that you have to remediate that in your interim year. And there's times we may actually, as your assessor, strategically say, hey, listen, you don't have the time, we're running out of runway, let's take the cap, let's take the 65 or 66. I'll give you an example. One of the things you need to do is an annual security risk assessment, right? And maybe by the time you're going to submit, it's going to be before you do your annual security risk assessment, but you have your previous years, and it can't be older than 365 days. So we'll go ahead and take that as evidence, but it's not going to get the full score. But we know that in the next year, you are going to do, because you do it every year, you have to. So these are an example when we might strategically decide together in order to get you certified to take the cap. And as I mentioned before about the asterisk, whether you have 1 cap or 100 caps, it does not matter. You're certified. There's no asterisk associated with having a cap. Okay. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, so we have some questions from people who attended, so we could go through them. And I was actually thinking maybe I'll give you the questions and you guys can decide who's going to answer them. And Sierra, maybe we could put the poll up while we're answering the questions, and then we could move on to the last slide, which has more resources. So this is the poll question, but while that's going, I'm going to say the first question is, has Enterprise Health completed I-1 certifications? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
Yeah, I can take that.
Yeah, let's.
Or I can at least start that. We haven't completed any any I-1 certifications, meaning we haven't submitted any. We are in the process of working on some. And I believe the I-1 was released in January, so we're about 6 months into that. And they're going pretty well. I mean, all things considered, I think we expected a lot of changes from the R2 assessment to the I-1, but we can use a lot of our existing resources on the I-1. Of course, there are some new requirements that we haven't seen before, so we have to build out a couple new tools and kind of improve on our understanding of those requirements. But yeah, we are in the process. We haven't submitted any.
Okay, that's great. Another question is, has Enterprise Health completed I-1 certification? Oh, sorry, I did that one right. What has been unique for I-1 certification where no PHI or PII is handled?
So that would be a unique situation, but similarly to the R2 assessment, you can mark requirements as NA if they're not applicable to your organization. So for any requirement in the I-1, or even for any part of a requirement in the I-1, if it's not applicable to you because it relates to how you store PII or transmit it, we would just, as an assessor, say, this isn't applicable because X, Y, Z. So it wouldn't really cause much of a concern there.
Okay. And I think you answered this one, but I'm just going to try. Can you change your scope in the middle of an assessment?
We would try to avoid it as best as possible, just because changing the scope you'll have to regenerate the assessment, and that might cause more requirements to pop up. It would depend on the timeline and the need. Hopefully, if a proper scoping process is conducted early on, there won't be a need for that. If there is, things can happen, either contractual obligations or new payers or new systems, etc. It is possible, yes, and we would have a thorough we would do a thorough analysis beforehand and discuss the pros and cons with the client, and then we try to figure out a game plan for addressing that. So it is possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, possible, but if it needs to happen, it has to happen, but highly undesirable. And one of the things we didn't talk about to go too far into the weeds with is there's a burning period for policy and procedure. They need to be burned in for 60 days, meaning you put them out there and you haven't changed them. But for implement it, which again is 40% of your score, right? Towards that's trying to get it at least over 62, but ideally over 71. That's 90 days. And so meaning that if you have a system, like you can't identify that a system needs an application needs some type of tweak on a Friday, and then on Monday say it's done, we're good to go. That has to be corrected and burned in for 90 days. And so if you were to change your scope with that and add other applications or other things to it, you could skew or throw off that burn-in time, and that could then subsequently push you past your desired submission date with that, which you do need reservations for now with HITRUST. So yeah, you can do it. I best not to.
Okay. And then the last question we have is, what is the level of effort required for recertification?
So I'll take the first stab at that. So as far as the effort, it's just about every piece of the initial validated assessment. For us, it certainly is. For you, the organization getting certified, you will have not quite the same effort, although it's going to be a completely, starts right from the beginning again on the latest version. And HITRUST updates their versions 2 or 3 times a year to the right of the decimal. So like the software, it's a little bit less of a lift. Every 2 or 3, 4 years, they update it to the left, which is bigger. But regardless, whatever you come out in 2 or 3, and when you get to your research, you're probably gonna have more requirements with it. So there'll still be more, but you will be, or will have been shored up in a lot of your, let's talk about policy and procedure again. Your policies and procedures should be in much better shape when you get to your research than your initial validated. But again, they have time and date stamps on them, so they're still gonna need to be revisited. From the assessor perspective, our work is the same with that. And I heard a good analogy yesterday. If you think about taking an SAT test or some type of test, someone grades it, right? So the second time you take it, you may know all the answers and do really well with it, but the person grading it still has to do all that work to grade it and look at every one of those little black bubbles that you filled out. So a little less of a lift for the organization getting certified, the same for the, not just our assessor, any assessor.
Okay, Liz or Ian, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, we've talked a bit about having dedicated resources and like a dedicated team for the HITRUST assessment. So I think one thing to point out is that we've had organizations that have gone through their initial assessment, and then come time for their recertification, there's an entirely new team working on it. Maybe the team lead left, and so no one who's there is familiar with the HITRUST assessment that they had just gone through, and that makes it almost like you're doing a whole initial assessment again. So familiarity on the organization side is huge. Of course, we'll know your organization and we'll have gone through, or your assessor will have gone through it the previous time around, and you might even have access to your previous assessment in MyCSF. So that can be helpful, but from a resources perspective, having someone who worked on the original one working on that recertification is a tremendous help.
Yeah, I'll just add too, since I think it's an important topic, the recertification with it. This is by design. This is when you can, speaking of an R2, so when we're talking about recertification, we're just talking about the R2, the legacy, the original certification, that you need to, whatever version you start on is the one you'll do your interim, and then you get to the recert, it's that latest version. And that's the time for, and HITRUST considers this, that you will open or close your aperture on your object, depending on what your business has done. So good examples are maybe you were acquired by another company. That's just happened with one of our customers. Maybe you bought another company, right? So now that scope has changed. Maybe you built a brand new application, or you bought a new application, or you've gotten smaller. So that's what we want to look at. So that's typically when I talked about the scope, we try to make it as narrow as possible. It's when we get to the research typically that we look to open and see if there's other things that need to be captured within that object. And all these things can change. You know, these are all things, you get new controls and more controls based off of the expansion or contraction of your object.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank all of you guys for coming and thank everybody in the audience for attending. We have a couple of resources on here to help. And if anybody has any suggestions as to ideas for future webinars, please let us know. If you wanted to set up time to do a complimentary scoping exercise, we would also love to meet with you and do that as well. Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.